Do-it-yourself guitar fretwork? It's not as complicated as you think. Hi everyone, so in a previous video I made the commitment to upgrade this first act guitar, and I decided to share the journey with everyone. So the first thing I decided to do is do some basic fretwork. Now this video isn't meant to be a tutorial, but more of an introduction to doing basic fretwork and all the tools that you might need to get the job done. So let's get to it. So starting off, the first thing you're going to want to do is remove all the strings. I like to keep the old strings intact, that way in case I need to test my fretwork at the end, I can just restring it without using brand new strings, because the prices do add up. And be very careful because, as most of you already know, the ends of the guitar strings are very sharp and you can end up cutting yourself. And I actually ended up bleeding a little bit because I got whipped by one of the strings when I was taking it out of the saddle. Once the strings are removed, it's time to protect the fretboard. You want something with a light adhesive such as painter's tape, and I try to get the tape as perfect as possible, so I use an X-Acto knife to get a nice snug fit. And be careful when you're using the X-Acto knife. Make sure you're lightly cutting towards the metal frets, that way you're not scratching up your fretboard. Now that the fretboard is taped off, usually you're going to want to make sure the neck is straight as possible, and to do that, you would adjust the truss rod, but this first act guitar doesn't have an adjustable truss rod, so I'm going to skip that step. But what you would use is a notched straight edge like this, and when you're doing it, make sure that you're adjusting the truss rod very, very slightly. Just a little turn, measure, a little turn, measure again until it's absolutely flat. But like I said before, I won't need to be using this. This one actually doesn't even fit on the guitar. This is more for a standard Fender or Gibson. So I did skip this step, but if you have an adjustable truss rod, make sure it's as flat as possible before moving on to the next step. So now we need to identify where the frets are uneven, and to do that, we use a tool called a fret rocker. And what you're going to do is you're going to place it on 3 frets and kind of rock it back and forth. If there's a wiggle, that means that middle fret you're on is higher than the others. Now, as you're checking and going down each fret, you're going to want to make sure to mark each uneven spot. That way you know when you're sanding where to focus. Once that's complete, you're going to want to take your marker and just rub it on the tops of all the frets. That way you know when you're sanding, it's kind of an identifier on what you're actually sanding and what spots you're not. I use a sanding beam with various size sandpaper. One side's coarse while the other one's more fine. So you're just going to lay it along the frets and you're going to lightly sand up and down. Some people will recommend that you only go one motion, just pushing it forward or back. I tend to just do both ways. I haven't seen a difference yet. So as you sand, you'll start noticing the Sharpie marks go away. And the key to this step is keep checking with your fret rocker to see where you're still uneven. Mark it off on the top again and then keep on sanding. So at this point it requires a lot of patience not to overdo the sanding because then it's going to get uneven again. So make sure to check as much as you can with your fret rocker. once everything is level, you're going to want to crown the frets, because right now everything is sanded flat. And you want to get a nice kind of dome shape to where it's touching the strings. And I use a fret file for that. Now this one I got off of StewMac, and it's been working pretty good so far. It's definitely faster than using a diamond file and slowly rounding it at the top on both ends. That's a great way of doing it too. I just don't have the patience to do that, and I find that this does a great job. One thing that you need to know though is to not be too hard when you push down and rub it against the frets, because that's going to get you a lot of jagged marks on the fret itself. So you can lightly go over it, applying a little more pressure, and that way it shapes it nice and evenly. So at this point, the top of the frets are good, but the sides are still jagged and sharp. So what we're going to do is we're going to take some diamond files and slowly file the edges down. This takes a lot of patience and a steady hand, because if you miss, you could gouge the sides of the neck. The one I used in the video was a triangle diamond file, and I would slowly push down and round out those edges so they're nice and smooth. Now it's time to polish the frets. Now what I suggest is use a finer sandpaper and just go over those frets a bit. That way it's going to even out any sort of pits or nicks on the frets. Once you do that, you're going to go to a steel wool. Get a really fine grade steel wool, and then you're just going to start rubbing the frets and just polishing them up. It's going to give them a nice shine, and it's also going to make the frets as smooth as possible. That way when you're bending your strings, everything's going to feel so much nicer. So this step can be time consuming and tedious. So I suggest just putting on some TV, zoning out, just polish the frets up as much as possible. More is always better at this point, because it really is a fine polish that you're looking for. Last thing you need to do is take the tape off and condition the fretboard. You can use various fretboard oils, but I use the F1 oil by Music Nomad. Just remember that a little goes a long way. So just dab it a little, take your rag, wipe it in, and then wipe off the excess and let it sit. So there you have it. The actual technical skills it takes to get this done is very minimal. But what separates a good job from a bad job is the overall craftsmanship, which comes from being careful and accurate in every step. From the start of the project, when you're taping everything off, it can be easy to rush through it and you'll miss spots. As far as accuracy goes, you don't want to gouge any of your wood with the X-Acto knife or the diamond files. You really want to be as precise and as careful as possible. And I understand that it does take time, so you want to rush it. You want to get it done fast and get it back into, playing condition. But you're going to make more mistakes when you just try to rush through this project. Another big thing is use the correct tools for the job. There are tons of tools out there on Amazon. Most of these things you can get at the hardware store, or you can alter your existing tools to get the job done. But make sure if you're doing that it's the best option. I'd rather spend a little more money on the correct tool than do a horrible job because I wanted to save some money. And if you want to practice fretwork, make sure that you do it on an inexpensive guitar. That way you can practice as much as possible before moving on to something a little more expensive and that you care about. That's it for this video, and if you have any questions, leave them in the comments, and I will see everyone next time.